On the 12th of April, 2014, a column of armed men crossed into a single town in eastern Ukraine and seized it by force. Within 5 days, that act of aggression had become a war, one that Ukraine never chose, that would kill thousands over the next 8 years, and that in 2022 would erupt into the largest invasion Europe had seen since the Second World War. This is how those first 5 days unfolded, and how a nation began to stand its ground. To understand the 12th of April, you have to start a few weeks earlier, in Crimea. That winter, 3 months of protest in Kyiv. The Maidan had ended in bloodshed and then in revolution. President Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia, and a new pro-Western government took power. To much of Ukraine, it was a democratic uprising. To Moscow, it was an illegal Western-backed coup on its doorstep, and Russia moved almost at once. The Donbas was not like Kyiv. Heavily Russian-speaking, built on Soviet-era coal and steel, it had voted for Yanukovych and looked on the Maidan with suspicion and fear. Real local grievances and real Russian ambitions now became almost impossible to tell apart, and that confusion was itself a weapon. In late February, soldiers in unmarked green uniforms appeared across Crimea, seizing airports, bases, and the regional parliament. They wore no insignia, and Russia denied they were its troops. Ukrainians called them the Little Green Men. In a swift, almost bloodless operation, Crimea was seized and then annexed by Russia after a hastily arranged referendum the world did not recognize. President Putin, who had first denied any Russian role, would later openly admit that those unmarked soldiers had been his own forces all along. A denial abandoned only once the peninsula was safely taken. Then the pattern moved north and east. Through March and early April, crowds, some local, some organized, stormed government buildings across the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. This was the Donbas, a heavily Russian-speaking, industrial heartland of coal mines and steel mills, pressed up against the Russian border. It was fertile ground, and someone was about to light it. Everything changed on the 12th of April. A column of armed men entered Sloviansk, a town of 100,000 people in the north of the Donetsk region, close to the Russian border. This was not a protest. These men were disciplined and they were heavily armed. Their commander was Igor Girkin, who used the nom de guerre Strelkov, the shooter. He was a Russian citizen, a military reenactor and a veteran of Russia's wars in Chechnya and Bosnia, and a colonel of Russia's military intelligence, the GRU. By his own later account, his small unit had assembled in and crossed from Russian-occupied Crimea. In a matter of hours, the group had taken the town's police station, its security service headquarters, and the city administration. They moved like soldiers, not protesters, and they wore green uniforms stripped of insignia. The same unmarked look the world had watched seize Crimea only weeks before. They broke open the police armory. By Ukrainian accounts, they carried off some 400 handguns and around 20 automatic weapons, enough to arm the local recruits who now flocked to join them. Around Girkin's corps of armed men gathered a swelling crowd of local volunteers, miners, veterans, and militants who saw the new Kyiv government as illegitimate. Whether they were led from Moscow or acting on their own became the central, bitter question of the whole war. The first blood was shed almost immediately, at checkpoints on the edge of town. Ukraine's Interior Ministry reported its officers killed and wounded in the opening exchanges. The exact toll of those first hours was disputed, but the killing had begun. The same day, and over the days that followed, armed groups took the neighboring town of Kramatorsk and a string of smaller towns across the north of the region. A self-declared separatist statelet was taking shape, building by building. In Kyiv, the new government now faced a choice it could not avoid. On the 13th of April, acting President Oleksandr Turchinov announced what Kyiv called an anti-terrorist operation and gave the armed men a deadline: lay down their weapons within 48 hours or be met by force. It was an army that had been starved for years, underfunded, under-equipped, hollowed out by neglect. And yet when the call came, its soldiers went east to defend their country's own territory, in trucks and worn-out armor, against an enemy far better prepared than they were. They went anyway. Around the seized towns, the defenders threw up roadblocks of tires, sandbags, and concrete, manned by a mix of Girkin's fighters and local volunteers. Sloviansk was becoming a fortress. From the first day, it was also a war of narratives. Kyiv spoke of Russian terrorists and saboteurs. Moscow's media spoke of a spontaneous uprising of an oppressed Russian-speaking people. Both sides flooded the airwaves. And for outsiders, the truth of any single event could be genuinely hard to pin down. The deadline passed. The weapons were not surrendered. On the 15th of April, Ukrainian forces launched their first real operation, an assault, backed by helicopters and armored vehicles, to retake the military airfield at Kramatorsk. After a firefight, the field was cleared, though the towns themselves remained in rebel hands. It was a cruel, confusing kind of fight. The soldiers sent to restore order faced not only trained gunmen, but crowds pushed out in front of them, human shields that turned every decision into an agony. When the general leading the operation tried to speak to the town, he was mobbed and had to be pulled to safety. Ukrainian units moved to ring Sloviansk and cut its approach roads, but the encirclement was thin, and the town was well supplied from across the nearby Russian border. A siege settled in that would last for months, and then came the moment that showed the world how fragile Kyiv's grip really was. On the 16th of April, a column of 6 Ukrainian armored vehicles rolled into the center of Sloviansk, flying separatist flags. Their crews, cut off and surrounded by crowds, had either surrendered or changed sides. It was broadcast around the world. Ukrainian armor paraded through a rebel-held town. For a state attacked before it was ready, it was a bitter, humiliating blow. But it was also the opening act of a fight the country would refuse to walk away from. Ukraine and much of the world saw a Russian hand behind it all, and the evidence kept mounting. Girkin's own intelligence background, the unmarked uniforms straight out of Crimea, and soon, the heavy weapons rolling across the border. Moscow flatly denied sending anyone. That denial would not survive contact with the facts. The men in Sloviansk were not only fighting, they were building a state. Within weeks they would stage hurried referendums on self-rule, votes that Ukraine and most of the world rejected as illegitimate, and declare their own people's republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. On the 5th day, the world's diplomats tried to put the fire out. On the 17th of April, negotiators from Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the European Union met in Geneva and agreed that all illegal armed groups would disarm and vacate the buildings they had seized. On paper, it was a breakthrough. In Sloviansk, the armed men simply refused to leave. The barricades stayed up and the guns stayed loaded, and within days the Geneva deal was dead. The aggression could not be talked away. It would have to be resisted, town by town and year by year. What began with 50 men in one town did not stay small for long. Ukraine now fought a war it had not started and was in no shape to fight. Its soldiers and volunteers threw themselves against columns of tanks and rockets sent from across the border, buying, with their lives, the time their country needed to build a real army almost from nothing. By the time a fragile front line froze in place, commonly cited estimates put the dead of the Donbas war at around 14,000 people, with well over 1 million driven from their homes, figures compiled by the United Nations and others. Those first 5 days set the shape of everything that followed. They showed how a determined armed group, backed from across a border, could tear at a neighbor's land. But they also marked the moment a shaken young democracy chose to stand and fight for itself, a choice that would come to define Ukraine. As for the man who led those first 50 into Sloviansk, Girkin himself would later put it in the plainest terms. In an interview with a Russian newspaper, He said that if his unit had not crossed the border, the unrest would have fizzled out, as it had elsewhere. It was he said, who pulled the trigger of the war. For 8 years, that front line barely moved, killing on a low, steady flame while the world's attention drifted elsewhere. Then, in February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine from the north, east, and south. The small, half-deniable war that had begun with 50 men in Sloviansk had become the largest land war in Europe since 1945. 50 men began it. But it was the people who refused to yield, the soldiers, the volunteers, and the ordinary Ukrainians of the Donbas and beyond, who would decide in the long years after how it would end.